And welcome back to the second of our challenge sessions, Net Zero Laws, NDCs and Green Recovery. Who is getting it right? I'm delighted to introduce the first of our four panellists for this session, Caroline Lucas, MP, the only Green Party member in the UK House of Commons and a former member of the European Parliament. Caroline has represented the constituency of Brighton Pavilion since May 2010. She's chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Climate Change and vice-chair of a number of other all-party parliamentary groups, including land value taxation, fuel poverty and energy efficiency, refugees and renewable energy and sustainable energy. Caroline, I would invite you to address the summit.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and it's a real honour and privilege to be with you this afternoon. The UN Climate Summit, just an hour's train ride away from here, really is our best chance of avoiding climate breakdown, of achieving climate justice and transitioning fairly to all of the benefits of a carbon-free future. But as we all know, it needs actions, not just words. And the title of this session is Who is Getting It Right? And friends, my short answer perhaps to that question is none of us, yet. And by that I mean none of us have all of the answers. But what's exciting is that increasingly we can see the shape of many of the solutions. When COVID-19 struck, for example, my own government, the UK government, listened to the scientists and took unprecedented action. It asked people to dramatically change their behaviour, and they did. It found the money needed to act, paying the wages of millions of people for months. And we had a little glimpse then that when there is a shared sense of the size of a threat, that governments can act in response to existential crises. And indeed, in some ways, they are the only actors that can act first with the scale and the scope that's required. Of course, the private sector is massively important as well, but it often needs the confidence that the state can offer, particularly in leveraging and de-risking investment. So the biggest analysis of public opinion in the UK shows that people want government to act on the climate crisis with the same boldness that they showed over the COVID crisis. There's plenty of opinion polls showing that there's a huge majority of people who want a carbon tax, for example, on polluting industries, or higher levies on flying, or speed limits on motorways, or a campaign to reduce meat eating, which I understand was a controversial issue earlier today. So the public are urging us on, and what is needed now is both political will and effective policy. And as both COP26 President and the nation that really led us into the Industrial Revolution, fuelled by coal and colonialism, I think the UK has a particular responsibility to lead that transition to a sustainable, just and resilient world. So in terms of learning the lessons from the climate legislation that we have so far, it is undoubtedly true that when the UK passed the Climate Change Act of 2008, it was groundbreaking, putting emission reduction targets into law for the first time. It showed how decisively governments can act where political will exists and when it's driven by an unprecedented campaign from across civil society. An Office for Climate Change was established, for example, sadly since disbanded, but that Office for Climate Change was designed to get things done across government. According to those involved, it successfully changed the climate question from whether to how. But the science on which that 2008 Climate Change Act was based has moved on. We know that we need to do more to keep below 1.5 degrees of heating. We know that we need to tackle the nature and climate emergencies together. They are two sides of the same coin. And we know that emissions from goods that are consumed in countries like the UK, but produced elsewhere, make up another 45% again on top of the UK's territorial emissions. And so those imported emissions urgently need to be properly accounted for in our legislation. So that is why I've worked with colleagues to introduce a private member's bill. And given that it is a private member's bill, I can't promise any time very soon that it will get passed. But that first Climate Change Act I referred to itself started life as a private member's bill. So give it a few years, and I hope we might just see this climate and ecological emergency bill actually in force. And essentially, it updates the science and it involves the public. It ensures that the UK's climate targets take account of those emissions from international aviation and shipping and those released overseas to produce the things we consume in the UK. It tackles the nature emergency as well as the climate crisis in the same legislation. And it gives people a real say in how we transition to a zero-carbon society by drawing on the creativity and ingenuity of people in the country via a citizens' assembly. And these democratic citizens' assemblies, which are genuinely representative of the population as a whole, are already increasingly playing a role in the legislative process. And what's interesting is that over and again they come up with policy proposals that are far bolder and more ambitious than most governments. So just last year, members of the first ever UK-wide Citizens' Assembly on climate was commissioned by 6 parliamentary select committees, and it spent 8 months learning about climate science before coming up with recommendations for government. And as I say, they came up with proposals like a frequent flyer levy and a strong emphasis on nature and a strong emphasis on fairness. But most of all, they wanted strong and clear leadership from government. That, I think, is what is needed so much now. We have a lot of targets in all of the countries around the world. What we don't necessarily have are the policies to deliver those targets. And I wanted to just say a few words about one comprehensive set of policies called the Green New Deal. And this is another bill that a number of us are pressing through the UK government. And it's based on a recognition, really, that there are so many win-wins when it comes to the so-called co-benefits of acting swiftly on the climate crisis. We know that swift action on the climate crisis can be good for fairness, for public health, for reducing inequality. And in a sense, that Green New Deal bill brings those ideas together. It recognises that action to address the accelerating climate and nature emergencies is about more than just staving off the worst. It is about imagining a better world which we can build together, where people and nature thrive, where resilient local communities, good jobs, successful low-carbon businesses and inequalities are addressed and opportunities offered to all, where progress is measured by quality of life and the well-being of all citizens, as well as health of our natural world. And I want to just briefly end by talking about 2 initiatives that I've been using to try to advance these ideas. First, working with a cross-party group of MPs at the Westminster Parliament to introduce this Green New Deal bill. It sets out a framework, as I say, that would mobilise every single part of government. It sets out targets to reduce emissions in line with our commitments to stay within 1.5 degrees of global heating, but also to restore nature and reverse inequality. It understands that we need to tackle economic and social injustice at the same time as addressing the climate and nature crises. Not only because that's the right thing to do, but because policies won't work unless we do that. And then the bill sets out the framework for the reform of our outdated financial and economic system, so that government is free to work with all sectors, public and private, to mobilise the resources necessary to invest in the complete renewal of our economy and society. It would put governments, not markets, in charge of the economy, so that we're able to make the big economic decisions that will shape our future. And because it's increasingly clear that the economic path that we've been following is destroying the ecosystem we depend on, increasing inequality and impoverishing lives, it changes our measures of progress away from the blunt instrument of GDP growth, gross domestic product, which simply only measures really the circulation of money in the economy, we move away from that towards a wider basket of genuine indicators of well-being, like health, public health, the state of our environment, our hopes for the future, and so on. And finally, it establishes an independent commission, again informed by citizens' assemblies, to develop the 10-year action plan needed to transform almost every aspect of life, while also honouring the UK's responsibilities to nations in the global south. And because the Green New Deal must also be global, I've been working with colleagues to bring together a global alliance for a Green New Deal. It brings together 27 politicians from 22 nations, committed to learning from one another as we are here to do today. For example, there is much that we can learn from Costa Rica. Costa Rica's ambitious decarbonisation plan aligns policies and action with limiting heating to 1.5 degrees. And so we're really excited to be working with Congresswoman Paula Vega. And we can learn as well from the signatories to the Declaration for a Global Green New Deal, like Miguel Costa Matos, Portugal's youngest MP and the lead author of the Socialist Party's climate law proposal. Or Ha-Young Jang, the South Korean MP, who recently proposed a carbon tax. And of course, then there are a plethora of Green New Deal bills in the US, including the Climate Equity Act, which is designed to ensure that all climate policies are also socially just. Just as there are tipping points in climate and nature that must be averted, I believe that there are social and political tipping points that we can try to encourage, the points where an idea catches fire and becomes unstoppable. And by learning from one another, we can replicate successful approaches, making change happen more quickly. By showing what's possible, we intend to add momentum to slow and insufficient international processes. And we'll also work together to challenge the institutions where they block further and faster change, whether that's the WTO, the IMF, or the World Bank. And what will make those challenges more powerful is that we are working together, North and South, an alliance that brings together politicians right around the world. So in conclusion, friends, keeping within 1.5 degrees of global heating requires that we must learn from one another as never before. That is what makes this globe partnership so important, and that is why I am so honoured to be with you here this afternoon, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. I would now like to introduce our second panellist, Deputy Samuel Onuigbo from the National Assembly, Nigeria. Samuel is the chairman of the House of Representatives Climate Change Committee, and Dr Onuigbo has represented his constituency in the House of Representatives under the People's Democratic Party since 2015. Deputy Onuigbo, I would invite you to address the summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to adopt protocol already established for want of time, because when I look at the program, I thought we were going to be assigned just about 6 or 8 minutes. But I can see that there's some kind of flexibility, so I intend to also work within that. Again, thank you very much. I will speak briefly, actually, from the Nigerian perspective, on the issues of net zero, NDCs, green recovery, and like she said, who is getting it right. But this one is going to be strictly from the Nigerian angle. Nigeria, as some of you are aware, is on the western part of Africa. And as today, the population is about 211 million people. And out of this number, about 60% of that are very young people who are raring to go. So, at first instance, or at first glance, you are likely to see that as some kind of time bomb. But when you look at it from the reverse side, you again appreciate that this is investors' heaven that we are looking at. And I'm saying that bearing in mind what happened when we did privatization of the telecommunications industry. We encouraged some of the established telecommunications firms to come and join in the privatization exercise in the early 2000s. But they considered it a risky business. But those who took the chance, who braved it, eventually realized that with Nigeria's population, any opening is an investor's heaven. Then I'm also going to look at Nigeria from the angle of what we call the Sahel challenge. Because for those of us who come from Nigeria, we know that the crisis coming from Sahel, talking about areas bordering Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, coming down to Chad, that is now largely a difficult area to inhabit because desertification, drought, and the rest of them have combined to render those places very difficult for anybody to farm or to do agriculture. Consequently, we see a push from there down to the northern part of Nigeria. And that has disrupted a lot of things, bringing with it desertification, drought, and of course you may also have heard about the drying up of Lake Chad. So these are challenges that Nigeria faces. And of course, when you bring this into context or juxtapose it against the UN resolution of 63281 of 2009 that talked about the security implications of climate change, you now see exactly what we are faced with and why we are working to find a solution to that. Nigeria, as you know, is an oil-based economy, totally. About 80% of what the revenue that comes from oil. And part of that, of course, is also coming from gas. So purely, Nigeria's economy is fossil fuel-based. And that's why when we are discussing about how to arrive at net zero, what approaches are you adopting, then you have to factor that in and juxtapose it against the realities of the time and know exactly how you are going to execute this to be able to arrive there without necessarily totally disrupting everything or at the end of the day creating poverty and hunger or even crisis. For us in Nigeria, we are ready, and we have done that, to show that we want to transit to net zero. But like I said, we are doing it in a cautious way. January 2021, it was discovered that the gas reserves in Nigeria is about 206.53 trillion cubic feet. And that's huge. If you add that to oil, we have a lot underground. So in our transition to net zero, we have to really bear in mind that gas will serve as a fuel bridge for us to transit because we know it is also harmful, but not exactly the way we are seeing direct fuel. So this is part of what we are taking along as we are going. However, bearing this in mind, I was able, by the grace of God, to sponsor a bill on climate change, which, by the special grace of God, has passed through the National Assembly and is now awaiting presidential assent. But in doing that bill, we factored in the issues of how we have enhanced our NDCs, because we worked on that and submitted it to the UNCCC in June of this year. And we did that taking into account some of the positive changes that have, occurred. When we did the NDCs between 2015 and submitted it, I think 2017, we set the unconditional standard of 20%, and then the other one voluntary, which is going to be dependent on the resources that we get, which is a part of the 100 billion that we're expecting. And that one was going to be 45%. But between then and now, we have increased that to 47%. And we have also identified, instead of 3 pollutants, we've been able to identify 11. And we also talked about gender mainstreaming to factor everything in and make sure that our NDC is significantly enhanced. And that's why when President Buhari spoke a few weeks back, just early this week, at the UN, at the COP conference. He talked about how far we have gone, and he was able to make the landmark pronunciation about Nigeria, attaining net zero by the year 2060. Now, the other question is, what have we been able to do to help us move or transit to net zero? What is the content of our laws? What have we captured? What other laws are helping us to be able to put these things together? For instance, the Supreme Court of Nigeria in 2009 passed, gave a landmark verdict that on the issue of pollution, you don't have to have local standing before you go to court, which now emboldens environmentalists to be able to challenge either a company or an individual that is not acting properly. In addition, in clause 34 of the bill, which has passed, we also stated that anybody that engages in any practice that negatively affects the resolve of the nation to attain net zero or any climate activity, such a person is guilty of an offense. So these are some of the steps that we have taken coming from the legal aspect to demonstrate that we are committed to this. But then, as we are talking about being committed to that, then it reminds one, it comes back to mind about the efforts that the developed nations are making to support the developing nations to actually move to net zero. It brings back to mind, the promises made at Copenhagen. How much of that has been realized? Are we being driven to attain net zero, and by the same time, you produce net hunger for the people of, developing world? Or are we truly determined to arrest the situation? I'll give you a proverb. In our place, there's something that happened. A mad person saw a chicken or a fowl that was killed by the train. And she picked up the fowl and said, if you did not hear the vibration of the train coming through the rail line, did you also not hear when the train was running? Because the reason I'm saying this is that the world knows that if we continue the way we are going, pretending that we are not hearing the sound of the train coming through the rail or not hearing the horn, that climate change has come and has come seriously, then we tend to be deceiving ourselves. It is important that everyone realizes that. Today, we are talking about net zero. We are talking about laws. We are talking about who is getting it right. Like she said, no one has gotten it right completely. But there's need for us to work as one team. Because climate change, pollution, they are borderless. If anybody told people from the western part of Europe a few years back that flash flood was going to kill people in developed countries like Germany, Belgium, and even in China, it would have sounded like Greek. But we used to say climate change is issuing, warning shots. These are no longer warning shots. These are living with us. So that's why trying to attain net zero is important. But we want to see genuine efforts. Because without genuine efforts, and from what we learned from COVID, wherever it starts from, is going to get to the other side. That's why all hands must be on deck. So in conclusion, I would like to say that for us, with what we've been able to do on the NDCs, how we have raised the NDC, what we've been able to do, how we have also been able to factor in our law that if you do anything that is not positive in terms of tackling the issues of climate change, you are guilty of an offense. And also given the fact that the Supreme Court of the Federal Republic of Nigeria has given a verdict that anyone can stand up and take up a suit against a company or an individual that is not acting in a proper form. So I do believe that this COP offers us a tremendous opportunity of coming together, of not pretending that we are going to wait till tomorrow. Because like I said, if we did not hear the sound of the train, did we also not hear the horn? We have to work as a team and ensure that we attain net zero. But having said that anyway, let me conclude by saying that whatever efforts we are going to make, we have to carry people along. This is very, very important. If we are transiting and you don't have the rest of the world coming with you, because I've heard what you said, the tremendous progress that the British people have made, and of course I've seen what the people in Sweden, so many other countries, Denmark, everyone is putting, just very soon when they are going to hit net zero. We all would like to hit net zero as soon as possible. However, it's important that whatever we are doing in attaining net zero must be fair, it must be just, and it must be inclusive in such a way that it captures the vulnerable societies and communities amongst us. And above all, whatever we're going to do must have a human face. It must not be draconian in a form. I want to thank you for your time, and I'll wait for whatever questions that may come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Onuigbo. I would now like to introduce our third panellist, Deputy Bénédicte Peyrol from the National Assembly of France. Deputy Peyrol was elected in 2017 and is a member of the Finance, General Economy and Budgetary Control Committee, and she is joining us remotely. Deputy Peyrol, we look forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, chers collègues, bonjour depuis la France. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier les organisateurs de l'événement actuel, Globe Legislators, dans le cadre de cette COP26 et de m'avoir sollicité pour intervenir devant vous. C'est un véritable honneur de partager l'expérience parlementaire française sur les enjeux climat. J'ai répondu positivement sans hésitation à cette invitation parce que je crois et je suis convaincue que la lutte contre le dérèglement climatique et la protection de la planète ne se fera pas sans une coopération internationale efficace et compréhensive des contraintes de chacun des pays du monde. Pour réussir, nous devons agir ensemble dans la même direction. Nos parlements, qui sont la voix des peuples, doivent être des forces de proposition, mais aussi de pression. Et c'est ce que je m'évertue de faire ici en France pour que nos gouvernements agissent en responsabilité pour le long terme et pas seulement dans un court terme qui est bien souvent d'opportunisme électoral. Comme vous le rappeliez, j'ai été élue en 2017, j'ai été élue à 26 ans au sein de la majorité d'Emmanuel Macron. Je n'avais jamais fait de politique avant, mon engagement était essentiellement associatif. Je travaillais dans le secteur de l'économie circulaire et en particulier dans celui du recyclage des déchets, dont j'étais un petit peu mobilisée à la cause environnementale, mais c'est vraiment dans le cadre de mon mandat parlementaire que je me suis fortement engagée sur cette problématique-là, et en particulier au sein de la Commission des finances, et en particulier sur le sujet de la fiscalité environnementale, et j'y reviendrai plus tard. Tout d'abord, je souhaiterais partager un constat avec vous. Depuis 4 ans, j'ai observé dans ma circonscription et au niveau national une vraie évolution dans la prise de conscience de nos concitoyens, mais aussi des politiques de manière générale, de la nécessité de prendre l'enjeu du climat et les enjeux environnementaux à bras-le-corps. Je pense que les catastrophes naturelles qui se sont démultipliées partout dans le monde, plus ou moins proches d'ailleurs, que ce soit les coulées de boue au Japon, que ce soit les inondations récentes en Allemagne, juste à côté de chez nous, que ce soit les incendies en Amazonie, je crois qu'on se rend bien compte que le dérèglement climatique est là, que ce n'est plus une théorie, que c'est une réalité dans nos vies. Dans ma circonscription, les sécheresses à répétition touchent les agriculteurs et il y a 4 ans de ça, j'avais certains agriculteurs qui me disaient de ne pas croire au dérèglement climatique et 4 ans plus tard, ils viennent me voir dans ma permanence ici et ils me disent « Mais Madame la députée, que pouvons-nous faire ensemble pour faire en sorte que nous allions vers cette transition écologique ?» La mobilisation des jeunes aussi. Tout à l'heure, des jeunes du pays d'accueil de cette COP26 et de cet événement témoigner de leur engagement. Et je crois que ça pousse également les gouvernements et les parlements à agir. Mais, et notre collègue du Nigeria en témoignait, l'action en matière environnementale n'est pas simple, elle est complexe. De toute manière, la planète et l'humanité seront gagnantes, mais entre la période de transition, il y aura des perdants. Et toute la difficulté et tout l'enjeu pour nous, parlementaires, gouvernements, c'est d'assurer une transition écologique qui soit juste, et je reprendrai le mot du collègue précédent, une transition qui soit inclusive. Alors, qu'avons-nous fait en France et au niveau européen? Uniquement du blablabla, comme dirait Greta Thunberg, ou est-ce qu'on a commencé à sortir du blablabla pour véritablement agir? En France, depuis 2017, nous avons voté plusieurs lois importantes et j'aimerais en citer quelques-unes et ce sera bien évidemment non exhaustif. Alors, on a voté une augmentation de la trajectoire de la taxe carbone dans une loi de finances en 2017. Cette trajectoire, elle était très ambitieuse parce qu'elle visait à passer, à atteindre un prix de la tonne de CO2 à hauteur de 86,20 € en 2022. Je pense que vous êtes très nombreux à avoir suivi les lendemains malheureux de cette trajectoire que nous avions fixée, puisque nous avons connu la crise des Gilets jaunes, une crise sociale très très puissante en France, qui nous a amenés à revenir en arrière, à reculer et à bloquer l'augmentation de cette trajectoire. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes à 44 € la tonne de CO2. Je crois important de revenir sur cet événement parce que si nous voulons agir demain, et moi je reste convaincue aujourd'hui qu'un prix carbone reste nécessaire pour avancer sur ces enjeux de climat et de transition écologique, j'aimerais revenir avec vous sur les analyses que j'en fais et pourquoi cette trajectoire carbone n'a pas été acceptée. Je pense qu'il y a deux points principaux. Un, le manque de transparence. Les citoyens français nous reprochaient de mal utiliser les recettes fiscales de cette fiscalité environnementale. Ils nous reprochaient ce manque de transparence, ne sachant pas dans quoi finalement on allait investir avec cette fiscalité environnementale. Ils ne savaient pas la part du budget français qui était dédiée aux enjeux environnementaux. Et un deuxième point, c'est celui du sentiment d'injustice avec des entreprises et des secteurs d'activité entiers exonérés de cette fiscalité environnementale, que ce soit les transporteurs routiers de marchandises, que ce soit les agriculteurs ou le secteur des bâtiments, et aussi parce que entre les personnes qui habitent en ville et les personnes qui vivent en périphérie des villes, que ce soit en zone périurbaine ou en zone rurale, eh bien, ça pesait beaucoup plus sur leurs revenus. Et donc, cette taxe carbone était mal calibrée et elle laissait sur le bord du chemin de nombreux Français. Et c'est pour ça qu'elle a donc été bloquée et qu'elle est en quelque sorte un échec. Mais je crois qu'il ne faut pas s'arrêter sur cet échec. Qu'est-ce qu'il faudrait faire pour faire en sorte qu'une telle trajectoire carbone puisse reprendre et les conditions de son acceptabilité? Alors, c'est la transparence concernant le budget de l'État. En tant que parlementaire, moi, j'ai fait voter un amendement dans une loi en 2018 qui vise à produire une annexe au budget de l'État qui répertorie l'ensemble des dépenses de l'État qui vont à la transition écologique. Et puis un peu plus tard, on est allé plus loin avec un autre amendement pour mettre en place ce qui s'appelle le budget vert. Et d'ailleurs, la Commission européenne a repris cette initiative. Le budget vert français, c'est quoi? C'est une annexe au budget français qui analyse et évalue toutes les dépenses de l'État au regard de leur impact environnemental. Et donc aujourd'hui, vous avez un document qui est annexé au budget de l'État, qui reprend 6 axes environnementaux, pas uniquement celui du climat, mais par exemple celui des déchets, celui de l'eau, de la biodiversité, et on regarde l'impact environnemental de chaque dépense. C'est un travail énorme pour l'administration, mais c'est un travail qui permet, 1, la transparence, 2, qui permet l'action politique. Il ne s'agit pas d'avoir un document figé, il s'agit d'utiliser ce document pour sortir des dépenses qui sont défavorables à l'environnement parce qu'on demande aux citoyens d'être exemplaires, il faut que l'État lui-même soit exemplaire. Voilà, en tout cas, ça me semblait important de revenir sur ces éléments pour faire en sorte que la taxe carbone puisse être dans nos discussions politiques et qu'elle ne soit pas et qu'on ne reste pas sur un échec. Autre exemple de texte que nous avons voté pour atteindre des émissions réduites et voire zéro net émission carbone en 2050. En 2017, on a voté une loi qui vise à mettre fin à toute nouvelle exploration et exploitation d'hydrocarbures sur le territoire français à horizon 2040, en n'attribuant plus de nouveaux permis d'exploration et en ne prolongeant pas les concessions existantes au-delà de 2040. Alors, nous ne sommes pas très riches en terres d'hydrocarbures, mais néanmoins, c'était un signal politique très, très, très fort. En juillet 2019, nous avons également voté la loi qui s'appelle la loi énergie-climat, qui fixe de grands objectifs de la politique énergétique française, avec notamment un mix énergétique avec une part de développement des énergies renouvelables très importante, et puis une réduction de la part du nucléaire à 50%, même si là, on sait sur le terrain que, notamment concernant les énergies renouvelables, c'est pas toujours facile à faire accepter à nos concitoyens, et en France, on a un énorme sujet concernant les éoliennes, avec une très importante réticence de nos citoyens de ces éoliennes qui, selon eux, détruisent le paysage pour celles qui sont terrestres, et pour les éoliennes en mer, il y a un sujet qui concerne la biodiversité aussi en mer, et il y a un vrai blocage pour développer ce type d'énergie-là, une vraie difficulté quant à l'acceptabilité. Aussi, j'aimerais revenir sur l'expérience française suite à la crise des Gilets jaunes de la Convention citoyenne pour le climat, souhaitée par le président de la République Emmanuel Macron, qui, en fait, cette Convention citoyenne pour le climat, elle était composée de citoyens français tirés au sort, venant de tout le pays, de tous les horizons, de tous les âges, et qui avait pour mission de faire des propositions pour atteindre justement la neutralité carbone à horizon 2050. Elle a auditionné plus de 140 experts pendant plus d'1 an et elle a fini par élaborer 149 propositions qui ont été présentées au président de la République et au Parlement. Ces propositions ont fait l'objet d'un texte de loi. Elles ont fait l'objet aussi, elles ont trouvé leur concrétisation dans le plan de relance français suite à la crise Covid-19. C'est une expérience assez exceptionnelle, avec une frustration de la part des citoyens qui ont beaucoup travaillé et qui n'ont pas vu forcément toutes leurs propositions reprises. Un exercice démocratique nouveau qui a pu poser question aussi aux parlementaires que nous sommes entre l'articulation entre la démocratie participative et la démocratie représentative. Quelle est la part de l'un et de l'autre? Mais néanmoins, ça a été un exercice extrêmement enrichissant en France. Je voudrais juste venir pour terminer, parce que je suis déjà trop longue, mais sur l'expérience et les mesures européennes qui sont prises aussi, puisque l'Europe ne reste bien évidemment pas en reste et a fait des propositions très ambitieuses cet été, en juillet 2021, en proposant un paquet de propositions, de 12 propositions très exactement. Ce paquet s'appelle Fit for 55. Il vise à atteindre la neutralité carbone à horizon 2050 et tenir l'objectif de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre de 55% au moins en 2030 par rapport à 1990. Parmi les propositions phares qu'il y a dans ce paquet de propositions, on a le renforcement et l'extension du marché carbone à des secteurs qui n'étaient pas concernés jusqu'à présent, comme le secteur maritime, ou encore la Commission prévoit de mettre fin à l'octroi de quotas gratuits sur le secteur aérien. Il y a un mécanisme de taxe carbone aux frontières pour assurer une équité pour nos industriels face à des concurrents d'autres régions du monde qui ne seraient pas soumis aux mêmes règles climatiques. Et il y a également des logiques d'accélération de la décarbonation de secteurs comme l'automobile ou le bâtiment, avec des normes climatiques de plus en plus exigeantes, dont l'interdiction de véhicules thermiques qui provoque de très importantes modifications et remous dans le secteur automobile, déjà en France, avec des usines qui ferment, avec des salariés qu'il faut reconvertir et donc des enjeux de formation qui sont extrêmement importants. Pour conclure, je crois que nous tâtonnons toujours pour assurer le caractère juste de cette transition. Là aussi, c'est le véritable enjeu des prochaines années, au-delà des enjeux climat, bien évidemment, et de la nécessité d'aller vers cette transition. C'est comment faire pour qu'on embarque tout le monde avec nous, que ce soit les citoyens, les plus modestes, mais aussi les petites entreprises qui n'ont pas toujours les moyens de faire cette transition. Il faudra mettre en place de nombreux dispositifs d'accompagnement pour faire en sorte que cette transition soit acceptable. Moi, je pense que, en tout cas du côté français, je mène des réflexions pour imaginer une protection sociale écologique qui accompagnerait les ménages pour faire face aux risques de transition, mais aussi aux risques de catastrophes naturelles. Et bien évidemment, la question du financement se pose. Enfin, nous sommes en retard sur le sujet de l'adaptation de nos territoires au dérèglement climatique qui est déjà bien présente. La lutte contre le dérèglement climatique ne doit pas nous faire oublier que le mouvement est engagé et qu'il faudra s'adapter. Nous, responsables politiques, on doit faire face au présent et on doit faire face aussi à l'avenir. Et pour l'instant, j'ai le sentiment qu'on fait un petit peu à moitié les deux. Néanmoins, il ne faut pas baisser les bras, il faut qu'on rassemble nos forces pour qu'elles se démultiplient et que nos chances soient démultipliées pour faire de la transition écologique une véritable opportunité pour aller vers un monde plus juste et en meilleure harmonie avec la nature et l'humain. Voilà, je vous remercie de m'avoir écouté et j'étais très heureuse de pouvoir partager avec vous ces quelques constats.
Thank you very much, Deputy Peyrol. I would like to invite our final panellist, Jairam Ramesh from Rajya Sabha, the upper house of the Indian Parliament, who will be again joining us remotely this afternoon from New Delhi. Jairam is a senior leader in the Indian National Congress Party and an economist. As such, he's been advisor to the Finance Minister and also to the Prime Minister. Jairam Ramesh has served in various ministries during his career, including the Union Minister of Rural Development from 2001 to 2014. Jairam Ramesh, I would like to invite you to address the summit.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to take off from where Caroline Lucas ended, which is her call for a redefinition of the very concept of GDP, which is really a binding constraint in any move forward on sensible environmental policies. As long as we measure and monitor economic growth through the narrow lens of what we define as gross domestic product GDP, we are going to be hamstrung in the years to come. And therefore, I entirely wholeheartedly agree with her that it's time to make the transition from a GDP defined as the gross domestic product to a GDP standing for a green domestic product, where we take into account in the measurement of economic growth, we take into account the costs, the ecological costs of economic growth, and also the ecological benefits that governments confer on societies through their actions. Now, I'd like to make 4 very brief and pointed interventions this afternoon. First, I do hope that at the end of Glasgow, the end of the 12 days in Glasgow, we've had the headlines, we've had the commitments for 2050, 2060, 2070, when most of us will not be around to hold ourselves accountable, and therefore it's easy to make these commitments. I do feel that the one irreducible minimum that we should expect from Glasgow is a finalization of the Paris rule book. Because as you know, the entire Paris architecture is based on a bottom-up commitment architecture and a top-down monitoring, reporting, and verification architecture. And 6 years after Paris, we still do not have complete clarity on how countries are going to hold themselves internationally accountable for the pledges they make. Holding yourselves domestically accountable is one thing, but holding yourself internationally accountable is the essence of a global agreement. And therefore, I think it's absolutely essential that we don't get carried away by the headlines that have been generated by the heads of state and heads of government, and hope that at the end of excruciating negotiations, undoubtedly, having gone through Copenhagen and Cancun myself, I can testify how excruciating these negotiations can be. But at the end of it, I think we should certainly hope for clarity and finality, not just clarity, finality on how the system to hold countries accountable for the pledges that they take voluntarily will look like, what is the design, and how it's going to be instituted, what are the institutions that are going to be involved in its enforcement and in its implementation. Secondly, I think a lot of talk has gone on in the last couple of days on the commitments of net zero. I myself have been quite a skeptic on this whole net zero approach, because I think the net zero is really a cop-out approach, because what is more important is to ask ourselves, what are the milestones in the 2020s? What are the milestones that we're going to hold ourselves accountable for in the 2030s? Of course, it's important to have an aspirational goal, and to that extent, the 2050 or 2060 or 2070 commitment has some meaning. But to me, the real meaning is, what are we going to do in the next 5 years, the 10-year, 15-year, 20-year horizon? And there, I think we need far greater homework. We need to work backwards from the pledges that the heads of state and the heads of government have made, and really get down to looking at what the milestones look like in the 2 decades to come. So I think it's important to get a stronger fix, a greater fix on the 2020s and the 2030s at the economy level, and certainly at the sectoral level in agriculture, in industry, in transport, and in other sectors of the economy. The third issue that I would like to say is that, having been associated with this, with the COP in various capacities, as a Minister of Environment, as I said, at Copenhagen and Cancun, and subsequently as a Member of Parliament and Chairman of the Indian Parliament's Committee on Science and Technology, Environment and Climate Change, I think it's important to give greater support, greater institutional support to the COP architecture that we have, which is basically, a 10-day affair in a 365-day year. And countries tend to slacken off, and a few weeks before a COP is about to be held, they scrounge around for announcements to be made, and the work begins to make that particular COP meaningful. What you need is a 24/7 by 365 institutional architecture. Not just multilateral. The UNFCCC is a multilateral agreement, but we need plurilateral windows. I mean, for example, we have the methane window now, which is a plurilateral window. So we need a multiplicity of these windows, and throughout the year, we are working, refining, and looking at the enforcement. In parallel, of course, to increasing the level of ambition, because very clearly we are nowhere close to having a level of ambition that would deliver on the 1.5 degree temperature rise limit that we as a global community have set for ourselves. And the fourth and final point I wish to make is that, climate change is only one of the 9 planetary boundaries that were set out in 2009 by the Stockholm Resilience Center. Of course, climate change, global warming dominates the headline. But there are other pressing environmental issues. There are issues relating to the loss of biodiversity. There are issues relating to the deforestation and land use changes, ocean acidification, ozone depletion, particulate matter, aerosol pollution, which has tremendous morbidity and mortality impacts, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, hydrological cycle. Now, some of these aren't being addressed. For example, through the Montreal Protocol, we now have the Kigali amendments, which look at both phase out and phase down of the HFCs. But it's important, I should point out, that once upon a time, the HFCs, the hydrofluorocarbons, were seen to be a solution to the problem of ozone depletion. And they were substituting for the hydrochlorofluorocarbons But now we know that the HFC, which was a solution at one point of time, is actually a problem from a global warming point of view. And hence, we are now looking at a phase down or a phase out of the HFCs. So what is a solution at one point of time may end up becoming a problem looked at from a different perspective. But I do wish to underscore, and this is something that I've been saying for a long time, that we face a multiplicity, a myriad environmental problems. The most immediate problem, of course, we face the problem of pollution and the impact it has on public health. We face the problem of loss of biodiversity and the way we manage our biodiversity. And in many ways, the COVID-19 pandemic is a reflection of imbalances in the way we have managed biodiversity. So while we focus on climate change, while we focus on the issue of global warming, it should not be at the cost or detriment of the other environmental issues, of the other planetary boundaries that humanity has either crossed already or is in danger of overstepping. So I think we should look at this in a comprehensive and holistic manner. Of course, let me end by saying that ultimately, international agreements, international commitments, international pledges are one thing, but there should be no dissonance between what a country pledges internationally and what it does domestically. Ultimately, it's the environmental policy of a country. It has to be embedded in the domestic political context, in the domestic economic context. You can't have, one set of goals internationally, and while domestically you're going in a different direction. So you have to bring about this convergence between sustainability pledges that a country makes internationally and sustainability actions that a country takes domestically. So once again, let me thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be with you, although virtually. I wish I had been with you physically face-to-face, but I suppose this is the best we could do, and I wish you all the very best.
Thank you. Thank you, Jairam, Ramesh, and to all our panellists for their speeches and contributions. It is now time to put some of your questions to the panel. And yes, please raise a hand and we'll make sure that we get your microphone switched on. I'm going to go first to the States Assembly of Jersey, the Parliament of Argentina, and then the Parliament of Uganda.
Thank you. It's Deputy Rob Ward, the States Assembly in Jersey. I live on a small island of 9 by 5, and our Assembly passed a proposition to declare a climate emergency and be carbon neutral by 2030. It then engaged the Citizens' Assembly, which agreed with this, and as was mentioned by one of our speakers, actually came up with more radical ideas. Since then, it seems that the Parliament has started to sort of step away from the commitments there when we look at cost and we look at possible behavioural change needed. Can I ask any of the panellists, really, what advice they would give for staying on the targets that have been pre-agreed, and what ideas do they have for us, perhaps the word enforcing is the wrong word, but encouraging actively to stick to the agreements that have been made previously? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I put that question first to Caroline Lucas and then to Deputy Onuigbo?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. I mean, I would say that if you've already got a cross-section of the public who are in favour of more ambitious action, then three-quarters of your job is done, in a sense. And so that feels to me like there's a real democratic licence for action. And in terms of how to mobilise more on that, I guess it is by just emphasising what I know you already know, which is that by going early, by taking action perhaps earlier, it's usually cheaper in the long run and the investments are greater. There may be sort of first mover advantage too in terms of businesses by being ahead of the curve. And I think in that respect, you can make an economic case as well as the obvious environmental case for moving faster. So I would stress the co-benefits, and I don't know what the different range of proposals that your Citizens' Assembly came up with, but I expect there will be quite a lot of co-benefits in terms of public health, if that's to do with air pollution, for example, or whether it's to do with active travel, again, strong health impacts, and looking at how, in a sense, you can save, there's a strong economic argument as well as the health argument, because you can save money in your budgets for your health system and other ways of having to deal with the symptoms of a situation if you go first and early. So I feel that if you've got public support on your side, yeah, I would say just try and get those co-benefits understood more widely, and also the economic impacts too.
Thank you. Deputy, would you like to respond to that question?
I listened to him attentively. I know that it's one thing to, in some of democracies, to pass a law, and entirely another to be able to give effect to the law. That's my, I think you understand me clearly, because in some of the democracies you find situations where the executive appears to twist the legislature. And in such a situation, even after you have passed a law, implementing it is the other key aspect. And if the executive is not really going along with the legislature, even though the law has been passed, then it becomes an issue. So I think you continue to mobilize, to get the support of the people. Because one of the things I said here initially to very many people around the world, the issue of climate change just sounded like Greek. But today, we are living with the realities, and the realities are totally unpleasant. So if those who are in leadership, those who are in the executive section, or sometimes the bureaucrats, if they appreciate and know that if we work together, that it's in everybody's interest, you just, as soon as you mobilize a little bit and create awareness, you probably get someone to listen and ensure that it is implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to take the question from the Parliament of Argentina. So our panellists in Spanish, so our panellists may wish to put their headphones on. Just bear with us a moment till we do so. Thank you.
Can I speak? Sit for inability. Sit down. Can I speak?
If it's easier,
¿Puedo hablar sentado? Porque tengo la pierna inhabilitada. Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo quisiera hacer un aporte. Me pareció muy interesante, Carolina, su trabajo, Samuel, Bénédicte y Jairam, sobre todo por el aspecto novedoso de su propuesta. Pero a mí me interesaría hacer un aporte que va en relación a una posición que al menos desde mi fuerza política en mi país la tenemos parado desde los consumidores. Y yo veo que en este tema de ir encarando las acciones para llegar a tratar de pelear por este cambio climático que no queremos que ocurra, el derecho de los consumidores en nuestro país es un derecho que tiene garantía constitucional. Y provee ese derecho constitucional un derecho que nos da a proveer un sistema educativo que es pero no es cualquier tipo de educación, sino que es una educación para el consumo sustentable. Y nuestro trabajo en el Congreso se desarrolló a partir de la redacción de un código que reúne a toda la legislación relacionada con el derecho del consumo. Y el camino que persigue ese código, esa legislación que queremos que se discuta, que aún y todavía no es ley, es llegar a tener un sistema de consumo sustentable y de economía circular. Y no podemos, cuando hablamos del cambio climático, dejar en manos del mercado y ver cómo tratamos los desperdicios de lo que consumimos. Nosotros tenemos la visión de que cuando se trata de los productos, es el mercado el que toma a diario la decisión de la manera en qué y cómo vamos a consumir. Entonces, eso pierde la naturalidad del consumo sustentable. ¿Por qué? Porque el mercado, el consumismo, impone que los productos tengan dos cosas. En principio, no se respeta el consumo sustentable porque lo que se quiere es que no se detenga jamás la rueda del consumo. Y deviene necesario una consecuencia que va directa al cambio climático, que tiene que ver con la obsolescencia programada. Las empresas que hacen los productos tienen, y quiero dar un ejemplo, los teléfonos, las computadoras, los autos, los vehículos, todos están programados hoy para que rápidamente termine su vida útil, no tenga una manera de poder repararse si se rompen, y de esa manera se genera ese círculo de consumismo que termina con el consumo sustentable. Entonces, eso requiere de ciertas acciones del Estado. En el caso nuestro, yo doy el ejemplo de mi país como un Estado individual solo, en donde nosotros proponemos que la garantía de los productos no lo sea de 6 meses, como lo es en general en la mayoría de los países. Tiene que tener al menos 3 años de garantía. Y a su vez, el proveedor y quien lo diseña, esto es más o menos como el problema de la carne que tratábamos esta mañana, quien diseña el producto tiene que tener algún incentivo o algún límite para establecer que ese diseño, para quien lo produzca, lo haga por términos que sean más largos. Y a su vez, que tengan la posibilidad de que la garantía sea más larga y que haya provisión de repuestos. En los últimos 20 años se eliminaron la mayoría de las actividades laborales de aquellos técnicos que reparaban los productos que se rompían. Y es una realidad. Y todo eso, si lo vemos a nivel global, los que diseñan, esto era como los productos que se utilizan para la agricultura y la ganadería en los países que producen, los que diseñan tienen que diseñar productos con un incentivo, ese es mi aporte, con un incentivo que permita que el diseño no tenga obsolescencia programada. ¿Y qué es el Estado y qué es lo que debiéramos a nivel global tener? Bueno, un sello que diga este producto, luego de su trazabilidad, es sustentable. Y un sello que diga que ese diseño y ese producto no tiene obsolescencia programada. Creo que es un aporte importante y que no tiene que venir desde los países que lo producen ni desde los consumidores. Y vuelvo a repetir como esta mañana, los consumidores no somos el último eslabón de una cadena de producción y de comercialización. Los consumidores somos todos. Y la virtud de un sistema económico que no solamente esté dominado por el mercado, sino con la intervención del Estado, puede permitir que el consumo sea sustentable y que no tenga obsolescencia programada y tener un efecto virtuoso y circular. Ese era mi aporte. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed. So a question there about waste that's produced by objects that have planned obsolescence built in, and the effect that that has, and the fact that we as consumers are often paying to dispose of that waste rather than the producer in the first instance. I'm going to go to Deputy Peyrol in the first instance with this question.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just check? It's the Bénédicte. Thank you.
Oui, la question que pose le collègue argentin, elle est majeure. Est-ce qu'on veut faire peser sur le consommateur ou sur le marché finalement la responsabilité de la transition? Je pense qu'elle est des deux, mais elle est surtout sur le marché. Et le consommateur, lui, il va regarder le prix avant tout. Et aujourd'hui, on sait que ce qui est moins cher, c'est ce qui est le moins durable. Et du coup, qu'est-ce que ça signifie? Ça signifie que je pense que les normes, on va faire peser des normes et des règles et des réglementations fortes sur les entreprises et le marché. Et si on prend l'exemple du gaspillage ou encore de l'obsolescence programmée, en France, on a aussi fait évoluer la législation pour interdire l'obsolescence programmée. Alors ensuite, il y a quand même la question de la mise en œuvre de la loi qui se pose également, parce que du coup, si on a un industriel qui mettait sur le marché des produits avec une obsolescence programmée, ça voudrait dire que derrière, il faut faire des recours juridiques. Et j'en profite pour dire à quel point la justice a aussi un rôle important à jouer dans ce combat pour la transition écologique. En France, on a des contentieux majeurs qui sont portés par des citoyens et qui invitent l'État à agir fortement, parce que l'État prend des mesures dans sa loi, mais et se donne des objectifs, pour reprendre aussi la question précédente, mais ne les met pas toujours en œuvre et ne les respecte pas toujours. Et en France, les ONG, les citoyens se saisissent de la loi pour faire des contentieux, et la justice fait son travail. Et je crois que ça fait avancer aussi les combats climatiques. Mais voilà, il y a la législation, et on avance nous aussi sur le sujet du gaspillage, de l'obsolescence programmée, de qu'est-ce qu'on fait des stocks, plutôt que de les jeter, on peut les remettre sur le marché, faire des ventes d'occasion. Et puis si je reprends l'exemple que j'ai pris dans mon discours du secteur automobile, par exemple, eh bien l'Europe et les États ont mis en place des normes très très drastiques, notamment sur les émissions de CO2, mais pas que, aussi sur les polluants. Et ça a invité toute l'industrie automobile à bifurquer. Et c'est sûr que si on avait uniquement laissé le consommateur choisir entre le véhicule thermique et des véhicules hybrides électriques très peu présents sur le marché, eh bien encore une fois, le citoyen, il va vers ce qu'il y a moins cher. Et aujourd'hui, en provoquant une offre de plus en plus importante, même si le véhicule électrique reste encore plus cher par rapport au véhicule thermique, on a fait avancer le secteur, non pas par le citoyen consommateur, mais par la norme. Et je crois que c'est bien évidemment majeur et essentiel que la norme vienne s'imposer au marché, et le citoyen consommateur, même s'il a un rôle à jouer, elle reste mineure par rapport, à mon avis, à la réglementation, à la régulation du marché.
Thank you very much. I think in terms of time available, I'm going to go now to the next question, which is from the Parliament of Uganda, and then we'll come to the Isle of Man Parliament, and I think at that point we will have to end this session.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. Once again, I'm a woman member of Parliament from Uganda. I don't know what others see as far as the increasing population is disturbing us, especially in the African countries. As we push for increasing the coverage of, for example, forests, still the population increase wants to degazette many of the forest reserves to occupy it. And we are also suffering from diminishing land for food production. So as we talk about preserving our diversity, the challenge of shrinking land for deriving food and livelihood is a challenge. That's why we need to come up with strong options for paying off all those people who have decided to maintain tree cover on their land. Please don't cut your tree, and you will be paid like this, so that somebody uses that money to buy other foodstuffs other than hiding into food production. I see as if that is a serious challenge to us. There are a lot of requests now for degazettement of forest reserves. This is a challenge.
Thank you very much. Can I put that question to Jairam, please?
Well, you know, there is this common perception that population is at the root of all our environmental problems. But somehow, I'm not entirely convinced. I think it's consumption, patterns of consumption, that are far more dangerous than population increase alone. In any case, many countries are going through the process of demographic transition. But we have the example of China in front of us, where population has been stable over the last 25 years, but the share of China in the world emissions has gone up from 10% to 27%. So it's what you consume and how you consume that is more important than population per se. I mean, this is not an argument for not having programs for managing a population increase. I'm not arguing for that. All I'm saying is that it's the consumption patterns, the lifestyles, that are very, very important. And I think that's where we need to pay far greater attention to domestic policies on environment and what they do in the process of economic growth, how are environmental factors taken into account. I just want to just make a brief reference to what Caroline Lucas said right at the beginning. I wouldn't look upon public health as a core benefit. I would look upon public health as the benefit. In fact, I think we should look at all environmental issues. We should look at biodiversity issues. We should look at global warming issues from a public health perspective. Because that's what will get political traction. And that's what will get a larger public constituency, larger public support. So rather than look upon public health as a core benefit, I would say the biggest argument for intervening in favor of sustainability enhancing economic growth is public health. And the COVID-19 pandemic exemplifies that relationship.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to the final question in this session, the Isle of Man Parliament, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I suppose it's a nice one to sort of round off with, really, in as much as what I see in front of me in the panel is a huge amount of experience in tackling climate change and issues. I'm here, obviously, not just representing the Isle of Man, but CPA and the small nations of the CPA. Can I ask the panel, what's the most effective moment in the committee or an APPG or in Parliament that they've had that's had a real impact? And what message or tip would they give to climate change committee chair of a small nation in the Commonwealth? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put that question to Caroline and then to Deputy Onuigbo, but could I ask you both to be brief, please? Thank you.
I was dreading that you were going to come to me first, actually. I wanted to have a bit more time to think about the answer to that question. I suppose the tip would be to make sure that you already have a majority in your committee that you've talked to behind the scenes first, so that you've squared the proposal with them before you bring it to the committee, so that you know what some of the sensitivities are and you've been able to negotiate some of those away. So off the top of my head, I'm afraid that's probably the best answer. I suppose as well, getting a lot of media coverage, so there's some pressure on the outcome of that committee, so people feel a little bit of outside pressure as well, and so that there's a sense that their decisions will be noticed and watched, and their constituents might well hold them to account against the decision that they take. And if I could just use this opportunity to go back to our friend Jairam in India, I would stand corrected. I think he's right on the health question. So I will remove the co before the benefit, and I agree with him. Public health probably is the best way of mobilising around this.
Thank you. Deputy Onuigbo.
Yeah, thank you. On how best to approach issues in the Committee on Climate Change Committee, I'll probably just talk around my experience when I chaired the Climate Change Committee and what it was like. I think I said that before, and perhaps I'm going to repeat it again, that at some point, particularly for those of us from developing countries, it seemed like whenever you were talking about climate change, in fact, some people would just tell me, people are doing something more serious and you are talking about weather. Some were calling me, the rainmaker, the man who brings down the rain, as a joke. But it's important to create awareness. Absolutely important. Because I recall that I had to hold series of awareness meetings, interactive meetings, with different ministries, different departments. And it was then I discovered that posting people to the climate change desk, which they used to call posting you to Siberia, I mean no harm to those who come from Siberia, was a kind of punishment within certain ministries. That was why in structuring the bill on climate change, we stated that there must be a climate change desk in most of the agencies, because it's very clear to us that climate change is a cross-cutting issue. It's not restricted either to environment, agriculture. It's there in transportation. It's in defense. Of course, you also can take it when we talk about women, because we also included women affairs as those to sit on the council, because our bill has a provision for National Council on Climate Change. That's to be chaired by the President of the country, and in his absence, the Deputy. So what this means is that we created that awareness, and we are still going ahead to create the awareness, because it is even the awareness now that has come down to make people know that, look, this is a real threat. And when we explain that from what is happening in Sahel, going down to those about 11 states in Nigeria, and that's why we came up with what they call the Great Green Wall Initiative, which came also all the way from AU before Nigeria domesticated it. And that Great Green Wall Initiative, if I'm going to take it to respond to my colleague and my sister from Uganda, the intention is to plant trees that are both economic and that can also at the same time serve as carbon sink. These kind of awareness became clear. We also talked about the drying up of Lake Chad. Lake Chad that used to be 25,000 square miles shrank to 2,500. It was based on that pressure from that side, desertification, drought. And then the next question is, where are these 30 million people who previously depended on Lake Chad for means of livelihood? So it was when we explained that they are part of those who have poured into the cities as farmers, fishermen, and herders. Their skills are not those of the accountants or nurses or professors in the university. Therefore, they make themselves available for any negative thing, so long as they can survive. It is when you have created this kind of awareness that when you now raise issues of climate change, then you see people listening to you. So interactive session is important, because even some people you thought were at home with these issues are not even at home with it. So if you create these interactive sessions, you'll be able to bring people on board. And of course, in some places, people don't like serving on climate change committee. That is another struggle you have to deal with, because it's perhaps not as juicy as some other committees. So it's important that you carry them along and you create the awareness and make sure that they understand that this is a serious business. Thank you.
Thank you. And just finally, if I can bring in Jairam for his response to that question. Thank you.
Well, if I got the question right, what is the best tip I could give as a committee member or as the chair? And I go back to the point that Caroline made, in which I then took forward. My experience has been that the best way to get political traction, best way to get government's attention is to focus on public health, is to focus both on morbidity and mortality. Not just mortality, but also morbidity. And I think that's the single most important task that I set for myself as committee chair for the last 2.5 years, to sensitize the environmental community to the public health impacts and to sensitize the public health community to the environmental causes of public health. So I think we have looked at health and environment as two silos. They are actually two sides of the same coin.
Thank you very much. At that point, we need to draw this particular session to a close, so I would be grateful if you would join me in thanking our 4 excellent panellists. Thank you too for your questions, but thank you so much.